Leviticus chapter 21 and chapter 22. We're actually going to go all the way to we're going to read the last 3 verses of chapter 22, and then we'll be going through the rest of the passage. Therefore, this is Leviticus chapter 22, verses 31 through 33. Therefore, you shall keep my commandments and perform them. I am the Lord. You shall not profane my holy name, but I will be hallowed among the children of Israel. I am the Lord who sanctifies you, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord. These passages that we're going to be looking at today is actually talking about the priest and the high priest and their expectations for them. So far as we've been going through these commandments, these laws that God is giving, there's been a lot of talk about what the people of Israel were supposed to do. But now God talks about what is the life of the priest supposed to look like. Because even what holiness and purity, what that's supposed to look like for the priest isn't just at his workplace, but it reflects throughout his whole life. And there are high expectations. You know, when you think of any job, there are supposed to be high expectations for those who are leaders in a company. Or, man, if they're a leader on some kind of a team, they're the ones who stand out. They're supposed to have the right skills. They're allowed to do certain things. The boss trusts them with certain responsibilities. When someone's on a team and they become team captain, well, they're supposed to be better than the guy who's on the bench. And today we're going to talk about high expectations God had for His priests and how they were to live their lives. They were expected, like the rest of Israel, to live their lives set apart. Now we need to remember that all of Israel was to be holy. But God had sanctified the priests, set apart them for a special service, a special ministry. They were to serve in His presence. And one of the things we have to remember as we go through this passage is that a lot of these laws started all the way back in Leviticus chapter 10. You have this terrible example of 2 priests who offered profane fire to the Lord and were killed on the spot. We've already seen priests who have failed in serving in God's presence. And God says, "You shall not defile me in my presence, in my tabernacle, in the place where I dwell." And the priests were to follow these rules so they would not profane the name of the Lord. They are to be role models to the people of Israel. Now there's this famous basketball player, I don't know how many have heard of him. Who knows of Charles Barkley? Sometimes you see his face. Yeah, he's a really good NBA basketball player. He was decent, you know. And one time he said, "I'm not a role model. Your parents are role models." And the thing is that he was saying there is that, you shouldn't follow me. And if you know anything about Charles Barkley, he once threw a guy out the window, okay? He was really mad at him. Man, this guy, you hear him, he has profane talk. He will tell you anytime that he is not the guy you should be following. Often we have the same perspective as a Charles Barkley. I am not called to be a role model. Don't follow me. Maybe you should follow the pastor guy. Or maybe the deacon. I've heard the intern this summer is a pretty good guy. Maybe you should follow him. But God has called all of His people to high expectations. Turn over real quick to 1 Peter chapter... Oh, I did not put a chapter number down. That's always fun. But it is 1 Peter. I think we're going to be... I think it's chapter 2. 1 Peter 2. Note to anyone writing a sermon, add chapter numbers. 1 Peter 2, verses 5 and 9. You also, as living stones, are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifice acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And then drop down to verse 9. But you are chosen, a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. God says to those who believe in him, you are a priest. Now, you're not a Levitical priest. One of the kids asked me actually recently, so Justin, are you training to be a priest? I said, no, I haven't offered any animal sacrifices recently. And the thing is, though, if you are saved, you are called a priest. And God has high expectations on how you are to live. And the thing is, as you mature as a believer, you should become a role model of what holiness and purity looks like. Too often we say, man, don't look at my life. How many of you have heard the quote, do as I say, not as I do? We should not live with that kind of a mentality. That our lives should reflect what holiness and purity are. That those who look at your life, do they see someone who's living for God? And how do we do this? How do we live a life that shows this example of holiness and of purity? And the thing is, we need to follow God's standard for entering into his presence. I need to rephrase that. We need to follow God's standard of what's acceptable in his sight. We need to follow God's standard of what is acceptable in his sight. We need stronger ties to the one who is above all. We've talked about how the Canaanites were full of worldliness, and the Israelites were supposed to separate from that. And the priests were supposed to be examples of what holiness and purity looked like. They were supposed to be all about God and not about the things of this life. So we're going to be covering two passages today. In the first section, my first point actually covers all of chapter 21 and then all the way to chapter 22, verse 16. And these are the expectations of holiness for the priests when they entered God's presence. The expectations of holiness when they entered God's presence. So let's start in chapter 21, the first 4 verses. And the Lord said to Moses, speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say to them, none shall defile himself for the dead among his people, except for his relatives who are nearest to him, his mother, his father, his son, his daughter, his brother, and also his virgin sister who is near to him, who has no husband, for her he may defile himself. Otherwise he shall not defile himself, being a chief man among his people, to profane himself. So the first thing we see is that God commands his priests, man, you shall not defile yourself with the dead among your people. The priest wasn't supposed to be the one taking care of the dead bodies. He wasn't supposed to touch it. He wasn't supposed to go near it. And some commentators believe that maybe, they're not even supposed to go to the funeral of a dead person unless it is of a close relative. And the 5 that he gives is his mother, his father, his son, his daughter, his brother, and then kind of the exception, a sister who's a virgin, who doesn't have a husband, someone who doesn't have a family that would be able to bury this person on their own. God says, I don't want you to be defiled unless in this situation. And in verse 3, it's kind of weird wording. For her he may defile himself. Now, I've mentioned this a few times, but it's important to remember that the word defile, sometimes being unclean in God's sight, doesn't always mean you've sinned somehow. The priest, God isn't saying, okay, it's okay for you to sin in this one instance. No, what he's saying, it's okay that you take time where you can't serve in the temple to take care of this dead body. Because the priest has got to realize, even if he take care of the dead body of one of his family members, he shouldn't serve in the tabernacle until he's clean in God's sight. That he should wait for a time. And what's coming up in the book of Numbers 19, is actually God gives how does someone become clean after they've touched a dead body. So you'll have to keep listening to Numbers. Don't quit listening to Pastor. But the thing was, he was not to defile himself in his way unless it was a close relative. And one of the things I noticed that's actually very interesting, notice that he doesn't mention the man's wife. The priest was allowed to marry. But guess what? He wasn't actually allowed to bury his wife. It's actually prohibited, according to this passage. And it's something very interesting. It's like, okay, and it seems like it's only someone who's a direct blood relative to the priest. And a lot of people would say, man, this seems a little harsh of God, doesn't it? When someone dies, man, you want to care for that family. When a close friend of you dies, and especially if it was the priest's wife, you would think it would be totally okay for him to go. But God said no. And for the high priest, if you drop down to verses 10 through 12, we actually see higher expectations for the one who is being the high priest. He who is the high priest, starting in verse 10, among his brethren, on whose head the anointing oil was poured out, who is consecrated to wear the garments, shall not uncover his head, nor tear his clothes. Nor shall he go near any dead body, nor defile himself for his father or his mother. Nor shall he go out of the sanctuary, nor profane the sanctuary of his God. For the consecration of the anointing oil of his God is upon him. I am the Lord. For the high priest, and with the high priest when it talks about the anointing oil, him being consecrated, so this was the ceremony that was done to Aaron to show that he is the high priest. And anyone who was in the direct line of Aaron, if they were consecrated, they would be the high priest. And the thing was, the high priest, since he was going to enter God's presence, the Holy of Holies, since he would be the one on the Day of Atonement who would offer the ram and the bull, who would be performing on that Day of Atonement, he was supposed to save from anything that was dealing with death, even of those of close family members. And notice it says that he shall not uncover his head. Now there's a little debate exactly what this means, because it could mean that he takes off his turban, or it means maybe his hair is unkempt. But it also says you shouldn't tear his clothes. And we got to realize, for the people of Israel, this is how you would mourn. The priest, the high priest, even with a close family member, even those who were closest to him, he was not to mourn for the dead. And it seems, man, this isn't very fair of God to say at all. This doesn't seem like, man, God should be saying this at all. A death of a loved one, the best way to show love is to go to that funeral, isn't it? But the thing is, God had set apart the priest for a special service. God had set them apart. And guess what? They're not supposed to put their family above God. Turn over to Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14, verses 26 through 28. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it? See, what Jesus, you see, a lot of you probably have red lettering there. It's Jesus who says this. And as you're reading it, it's kind of confusing. You're like, oh man, Jesus says, if you need to hate your father and your mother, your wife, your children, your family member, those who are closest to you. I thought Jesus was about love. And actually, we do see in 1 Timothy 5:8 that God says, man, you do need to take care of your parents. That it's something that's very important. That you are worse than a sinner if you don't take care of them. See, God does have a desire that you do care for your family and you love those who are close to you. But God says family doesn't come above God. That it doesn't come before Him. See, the priest wasn't to defile himself by taking care of a dead body, not because he didn't love them, but it was because they were totally God's, set apart for a purpose. And they were not to defile the tabernacle where they served and defile the name of God. And they weren't supposed to put family above that. And Jesus isn't encouraging his disciples, those who follow him, to hate your family. But would you be willing to leave your family to follow after God more than anything? Is there anyone we put above God? See, the thing with death is that it's not a part of God's design. When God created the world, there was no death. And God says in the new heavens and the new earth, there will be no death. It's not part of God's plan for death to exist. So the reason why the priests weren't supposed to take care of dead bodies, they would be defiled because guess what? Death is separate from God. It's not a part of him. You know, one of the things we've said at church, and I think we should keep emphasizing, is death means separation. Death isn't a part of what God designed this world to be. And the priests were to stay away from it because they would be defiled, and God's name will not be profaned. The priest was to be holy and pure in God's eyes. So what are some of the other qualifications? Well, let's look at verses 5 and 6. Verses 5 and 6 of chapter 21, they read, "They shall not make any bald place on their heads, nor shall they shave the edges of their beards, nor make any cuttings in their flesh. They shall be holy to their God and not profane the name of their God, for they offer the offerings of the Lord, made by fire, and the bread of their God." So the bread of their God, it's not a term that's come up quite a whole lot in Leviticus, yes, but that is referring back to the grain offering. So that's just something to keep in mind there. But verse 5 should actually remind us of chapter 19. This was something that was commanded of all of Israel not to do, to be shaving themselves in these certain ways, to making cuttings in their flesh. And this was often a way the people would mourn or even honor the dead. Now, I'm not saying like you love the people and they're showing love. No, they're showing worship to their ancestors in this way. And the priest was not supposed to do that. They weren't supposed to take part in these pagan practices because they were supposed to be holy to their God, set apart to his purposes. And then we read verses 7 and 8. "They shall not take a wife who is a harlot or a defiled woman, nor shall they take a woman divorced from her husband, for the priest is holy to his God. Therefore you shall consecrate him, for he offers the bread of your God. He shall be holy to you, for I, the Lord, who sanctify you, am holy." And then actually, if you drop down to verses 13 through 15, we see kind of the same rule for the high priest, but with a few added things. "And he shall take a wife in her virginity, a widow or a divorced woman or a defiled woman or a harlot. These he shall not marry, but he shall take a virgin of his own people as wife. Nor shall he profane his posterity among his people, for I, the Lord, sanctify him." What's going on here? So we see that the priest, so this would have been true of any priest serving the tabernacle, he's not supposed to marry anyone who's been a harlot, who's been divorced, who's committed anything pretty much sexually immoral, who has broken God's design of what marriage is supposed to look like. And for the high priest, it says he's supposed to marry a virgin. And, so what's the difference between, all the priests and the high priests going on here? Because, don't they want to marry a virgin, someone who's been pure? Well, the priests, any of the priests in the tabernacle could have married someone who had a husband at one point, but then they died. That would have been okay. For the high priest, it was someone who's never been married before, someone who's been a virgin, someone who is pure. And the thing is, so why is God giving this commandment? God has already given similar commands to the rest of the people of Israel. You're not supposed to be, marrying outside of Israel. You're not supposed to be going after the harlot, That's supposed to be pushed out of Israel because that's what the Canaanites practiced. So why is God telling this to the priests? This is what all of Israel is supposed to follow. Well, we see the answer in verse 15. Nor shall he profane his posterity among his people. Now, posterity isn't a word we use very much, but this would have been the priest family tree. See, the reason the priest wasn't supposed to marry someone who was immoral, who had broken God's design of how marriage was supposed to be. The thing was, if he married such a person, he would have defiled the family line. He would have profaned his family. And the thing is, anything that's profane, anything that's been defiled in God's sight, so if the priest defiles his family, guess what? They're not supposed to serve in the tabernacle. They're not supposed to serve in the temple when the temple would come about years and years later. The priest was to have a family that was holy and acceptable in God's sight. Too often, people are willing to put relationships above God. And this is really any relationship when you think about it. They're willing to associate themselves with people, and marriage is the closest association you can have with a person. People are willing to associate with those who perform wickedness, who do wrong, who aren't holy in God's sight. And they allow those people to influence them. And it affects their family. It affects their own life. And the thing is, the priest was supposed to have his life, and even his relationship, even within his family. When people looked at it, they were supposed to be looking at a man who role modeled a family that was pure and holy in God's sight. Someone the people could look to as one who was following after God. Think of the priest Eli. Think of the priest Eli. He had 2 sons that were doing wicked things in the tabernacle. They were taking advantage of the people of Israel and taking advantage of the offerings being made to the Lord. And Eli did nothing about it. His family had been profaned because they weren't serving the Lord. And Eli was very passive about what was going on there. He didn't take action. And guess what? God removed Eli and his family from the priesthood because Eli didn't take charge in the direction his family would go. He was not being the role model he was supposed to be. God requires those who lead to be good role models to his people, to follow what God has set as the standard. Well, let's keep reading. Verses 16 through 24. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron, saying, No man of your descendants in succeeding generations who has any defect may approach to offer the bread of his God. For any man who has a defect shall not approach. A man blind or lame who has a marred face or any limb too long. A man who has a broken foot or a broken hand or is a hunchback or a dwarf, or a man who has a defect in his eye, or eczema, or a scab, or is an eunuch. No man of the descendants of Aaron, the priest who has a defect, shall come near to offer the offerings made by fire to the Lord. He has a defect. He shall not come near to offer the bread of his God. He may not eat the bread of his God, both the most holy and the holy. Only he shall not go near the veil or approach the altar because he has a defect. Lest you profane my sanctuaries, for I, the Lord, sanctify them. Now, as you go through Levitical law, there's actually a lot of things people are going to point at in Leviticus and say, man, God isn't being fair. Man, I had someone, I was at work one time, they said, you know what? The Bible, it's evil. It has a lot of wrong things about it. And this is something people can easily point at. Man, it isn't fair. Man, this person who has a defect, why shouldn't they be allowed to serve in God's tabernacle? Man, this person, why if they have good character? Man, they have all the right qualities. If you look at Israel's history, the guys who are healthy, didn't always make good priests anyway. So why couldn't the guy who has a defect not serve in God's tabernacle? Well, the simple answer is, God said so. But the thing was that God says it would profane the tabernacle. And why is this? Well, it's because a defect is the result of the curse. See, mankind wasn't made to have these kind of defects. They weren't made to be blind. They weren't made to be lame. And any of these things, this was at fault. The fault of this is because of what happened when Adam and Eve sinned. And God says this would profane my temple. Man, and the thing is, God's name cannot be profaned. And He is holy. And actually, we see God's love for even those who have these kind of defects. See, one of the things that's easy to kind of skip over, but it says He can eat of the portion of the priest. It says directly, He may eat of the bread of His God, both the most holy and the holy. So the things that were offered to the Lord, the priests were allowed to take a portion of it and eat it for themselves. And the thing is, the one who has this defect would still be allowed to do this. God isn't saying that, I don't love this person. God isn't saying, this person can't be holy. God isn't saying, push this one out of my sight. God isn't saying that. God is asking this one who has a defect to serve God where God has placed him. He can't serve in the tabernacle, but God hasn't actually disqualified this one to serve as a Levite. The Levites were given tasks as well to do, and he wasn't disqualified from that. This one could still serve in that way, but he was not allowed to serve in the tabernacle. And the thing is, we still see God's love. People may point out and say that, it seems like God isn't being fair here. If you look at all of human history, I like to study a lot of myths and stuff and a lot of mythical creatures. And the thing was, people believed there was this one mythical creature that, guess what? He would steal your beautiful baby and replace it with one who was ugly. And what people weren't thinking is that they would have this baby, it would be born with a defect, and guess what? They'd get rid of it. Because they're like, this was replaced by some kind of weird creature. Mankind has often not shown love towards these people. In many countries, if you have a baby born with an imperfection, you can get rid of it. That's okay. But we see that God has shown love, and actually He's required the people of Israel back in Leviticus chapter 19, verses 14, you shall not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but shall fear your God. They weren't supposed to be taking advantage. They weren't supposed to make a mockery of those who had these defections. They were to love them all the same. And the thing is, we got to understand that, we need to serve God and follow His standard, even when He says you can't serve in this area. One of the things I was thinking about as I was driving up here is, I really appreciated the ministry of Ron Hamilton. He's written many songs. He's the one who's made a lot of discs, Patch the Pirate stories for kids to learn. But there was a time where he reached a point in his life when he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's where his ministry had to end because he wasn't going to be able to do it. He had something that was going to prevent him from serving in a certain way. But it didn't stop him from loving God. It didn't stop him from showing the world that there was a God to follow. Whenever music was played, you just saw him lit up because he loved God. A lot of people become bitter when bad things happen to them, especially, you can think of things that can happen. People can be blinded, they can become deaf, they can become lame in some way. Something can happen to them, and it may prevent them from serving the Lord in how they used to. But God, you can still love God, and God still has a purpose for even that person, and God still shows love to that person. Look at Jesus' ministry in the Gospels, how he showed compassion to those who were in need, to the people that were forgotten, to the lame man who the disciples were like, don't bother Jesus right now. God has shown his love even to those people. But we do see that God has prevented these ones who have a defect to serve in his tabernacle. And that was so that his name shouldn't be profaned. And the one who had his defect wasn't supposed to harp on, this isn't fair. He was supposed to see that, you know what, I can't serve because guess what? That's not where God would have me to be. Well, let's keep reading. So now we get to chapter 22. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron and his sons that they separate themselves from the holy things of the children of Israel, and that they do not profane my holy name by what they dedicate to me. I am the Lord. Say to them, whoever of all your descendants throughout your generation who goes near the holy things which the children of Israel dedicate to the Lord, while he has uncleanness upon him, that person shall be cut off from my presence. I am the Lord. So this kind of enters a new section for what the priests were supposed to do, and it's actually going to talk about in verses 4 through 8 that the priests were supposed to be pure. And it's something that God had talked about to the people of Israel. There's a lot of similar commands. But the reason why the Lord is emphasizing it with the priests is he has a purpose behind it. He says the priests are the ones who are making offerings to the Lord. And they weren't supposed to profane what the people of Israel were dedicating to the Lord. And actually, we see an example of this all the way back in Leviticus chapter 10. If you want to turn there, Leviticus chapter 10. This is the narrative of Nadab and Abihu. Leviticus chapter 10, verse 10 and 11. That you may distinguish between holy and unholy, and between unclean and clean, and that you may teach the children of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them by the hand of Moses. And then if you want to jump down to verse 19. And Aaron said to Moses, look, this day they have offered their sin offering and the burnt offering before the Lord, and such things have befallen me. If I had eaten the sin offering today, would it have been accepted in the sight of the Lord? So when Moses heard that, he was content. So all the way back in Leviticus chapter 10, God is commanding the priests that you know what is clean and unclean, holy and unholy. And the reason that God gives this command is because Nadab and Abihu, they have offered profane fire to the Lord. And the Lord struck them dead. And the thing was that we see that Aaron is actually concerned that Nadab and Abihu had profaned this offering that had been given to the Lord. See, and actually, I'll read verses 16 through 18 as well. I probably should have just read that whole section. Then Moses made careful inquiry about the goat of the sin offering, and there it was burned up. And he was angry with Eleazar and Itmar, the sons of Aaron, who were left, saying, why have you not eaten the sin offering in a holy place, since it is most holy, and God has given it to you to bear the guilt of the congregation, to make atonement for them before the Lord. See, its blood was not brought inside the holy place. Indeed, you should have eaten it in a holy place, as I have commanded. I mean, the reason that Moses is upset is because the priests have already sinned today. And the thing was that the priests were supposed to eat a portion of the portion that that God has given them. And the thing was that Aaron and his sons hadn't eaten their portion of the sin offering. And Moses is questioning why. And Aaron gives his reason in verse 19 and 20 because he says, you know what? We've offered these offerings, and guess what? These things have befallen us. Nadab and Abihu have died. And the thing was, the priests were supposed to be holy and pure in God's sight, because guess what? They could actually profane, they could defile the offering being presented to the Lord. The priest was supposed to be holy and pure because guess what? He's the one who's representing the people in God's sight. And there was not supposed to be a sacrifice that was defiled in any way. The priest was to be careful because he needs to realize the seriousness of the responsibility God has given him. That he was representing the people in God's sight. So verses 4 through 8, it reads, "Whatever a man of the descendants of Aaron who is a leper or has discharge shall not eat of the holy offerings until he is clean. And whoever touches anything made unclean by a corpse or a man who has had an emission or a semen, or whoever touches any creeping thing by which he would be made unclean, or any person by whom he would become unclean, whatever his uncleanliness may be, the person who has touched any such thing shall be unclean until evening, and shall not eat the holy offerings unless he washes his body with water. And when the sun goes down, he shall be clean, and afterward he may eat the holy offerings because it is his food. Whatever dies naturally or is torn by beasts, he shall not eat, to defile himself with it. I am the Lord." And so, if you might recognize some of these commands. We talked a lot about these in earlier passages on how Israel is supposed to be pure in God's sight. And some of you are probably thinking, man, Justin, if we could have just covered those 8 verses, you wouldn't have had to preach all those sermons. Well, God condensed and he didn't have everything. But God is requiring the priests to follow the same commandments as the people of Israel, to be pure. And the reason why he emphasizes it here is so that the tabernacle wouldn't become defiled, that God's name wouldn't be profaned, that there would be nothing connected of wickedness to God's name. And the thing is, often leaders, spiritual leaders, pastors, deacons, there have been a lot who have failed in purity in their walk with the Lord, and they try and cover it up and hide it. They try and hide it in such a way because, they're a leader. They love receiving praise, or either they're just like, man, I'm going to be removed from my position. But the thing is that God commands that, leaders, they need to be pure and holy unto God. And if there is some sin that would keep a leader from serving, he needs to step down and seek forgiveness. In verse 9, we see the seriousness of what God has for these priests. "They shall therefore keep my ordinance, lest they bear sin for it and die thereby, if they profane it." The priest would die if he would somehow profane any offering, if he would profane the tabernacle. If God's name was profaned, he would die. He would bear his sin. When God gives someone a ministry and they fail at it, there are serious consequences. Tom was talking this morning about Ezekiel. And if you read chapter 3, it talks about how Ezekiel, he's supposed to share a message of mourning, of woe, of judgment upon the people of Israel. And the thing was that Ezekiel is someone who is like a guard. He was one who saw judgment coming, and guess what? He was called to share a message. And the thing was, if he didn't share it, the blood of the people would be upon him. But if he did share the message, the blood of the people would be upon them. When God gives a ministry, when God sets up leaders in a certain position, he has high expectations for them to be serving God at the level that God has for them. We have the qualifications of a pastor in 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 7. And followed by that, we see the qualifications of who a deacon is supposed to be. The pastor and the deacon are supposed to meet those qualifications. And as a church, sometimes, we're supposed to be one who recognizes those qualifications in those leaders. Too often we have set up leaders in our churches and we look towards people who are just a really good personality. Someone who has a strong will. Someone who knows how to control a crowd. They're outspoken. Someone who's a good manipulator. But God requires that those who are set in a position of leadership, who watches over God's people, that they be holy and pure in His sight. And if there was ever anything that they should need to step down from serving the Lord because they have failed God in some way, they need to do so. Yes, they can be forgiven. Yes, God will forgive them if they repent. But there are things that God says that, you know what? If this person does this thing, they cannot serve in this way. God has high expectations to those who lead. Lead well. Now verses 10 through 16. Now no outsider shall eat the holy offering. One who dwells with the priest or a hired servant shall not eat the holy thing. But if the priest buys a person with his money, he may eat of it, and one who is born in his house may eat his food. If the priest's daughter is married to an outsider, she may not eat of the holy offerings. But if the priest's daughter is a widow or divorced, and has no child, and has returned to her father's house, as in her youth, she may eat her father's food, but no outsider shall eat it. And if a man eats the holy offering unintentionally, then he shall restore a holy offering to the priest, and add 1/5 to it. They shall not profane the holy offerings of the children of Israel, which they offer to the Lord, or allow them to bear the guilt of trespass when they eat their holy offerings, for I, the Lord, sanctify them. You know what's amazing is that God, He calls it an everlasting statute between Him and the priest. And He has given them a portion of the offering that you may eat of it. And the thing it was only dedicated to the priest and to those that were inside his family. No outsider shall eat of it. Or if the priest's daughter was to marry an outsider, someone who's outside of Israel, they were not to eat of this portion. And God says if someone were to accidentally or unintentionally eat of this portion, they were to restore it. And that they were to add 1/5 to it. And now there's question how exactly this would be done, but since it's an offering, this man would need to make an offering to the Lord at that time. And would need to add more to it so that, the priests have received what their due is. Because that was dedicated only to the priest. And no one else was supposed to eat of it, because that would defile what God had made holy. That would defile what God had made holy. Now the thing, as Moses is giving these commands to Aaron and his sons, to the future priest, the people of Israel are to hold him accountable. At the beginning of chapter 21, in verse 1, it says that Moses is speaking to the priests, the sons of Aaron. But then at the end of chapter 21, it says, and Moses told it to Aaron and his sons and to all the children of Israel. The priests didn't have some kind of secret code that they were following, and they weren't accountable to anybody. But the people of Israel were to also make sure that the priests followed these commands, that the priest and the line of priests were holy unto God. God has high expectations for those who lead. And those who serve in God's presence, He says, this is the standard that's acceptable in my sight. But then we get to the end of chapter 22. We get to the end of chapter 22, and this is our second point for tonight. What is acceptable should cost us. What is acceptable should cost us. And we're just going to read verses 17 through 30. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron and his sons and to all the children of Israel, and say to them, whatever a man of the house of Israel or of the strangers in Israel who offers his sacrifice for any of his vows or for any of his free will offerings, which they offer to the Lord as a burnt offering, you shall offer of your own free will a male without blemish from the cattle, from the sheep, or from the goats. Whatever has a defect you shall not offer, for it shall not be acceptable on your behalf. And whoever offers a sacrifice of a peace offering to the Lord to fulfill his vow, or a freewill offering from the cattle or the sheep, it must be perfect to be accepted. There shall be no defect in it. Those that are blind or broken or maimed or have a euchre and eskrima or scabs, you shall not offer to the Lord, nor make any offering by fire of them on the altar to the Lord. Either a bull or a lamb that has any limb too long or too short, you may offer as a freewill offering, but for a vow it shall not be accepted. You shall not offer to the Lord what is bruised or crushed or torn or cut, nor shall you make any offering of them in your land. Nor from a foreigner's hand shall you offer any of these as the bread of your God, because there's corruption is in them, and defects are in them. They shall not be accepted on your behalf. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, when a bull or a sheep or a goat is born, it shall be 7 days with its mother. And from the 8th day and thereafter it shall be accepted as an offering made by fire to the Lord. Whether it is a cow or a ewe, do not kill both her and her young on the same day. And when you offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving to the Lord, offer it of your own free will. On the same day it shall be eaten. You shall leave none of it until morning. I am the Lord. So what's going on here? Moses gives this command to the people of Israel that anything offered to the Lord should not have a defect in it. I mean, it shouldn't have any blemish on it. And the thing was, as the people of Israel are bringing offering to the Lord, they were to give their best. They weren't supposed to be looking at their flocks or their cattle, any of their livestock, and be like, man, that one broke its leg yesterday. Man, I could just really offload that one on God. I'll just give that one as an offering. He was supposed to not see it as an offering as a way, just, I'll appease God real quick with, just enough. He was supposed to see what was the cream of the crop, the best of his livestock. And whatever was his best, he was to give to the Lord. And God expects us as well to give well. See, often we like to give God the scraps. We like to give God the leftovers. Man, I didn't have a lot of time for my devotions today, or I didn't have a lot of time to spend time in prayer. Man, I was really busy. We like to give it over like, man, you know what? I was just really busy. We come up with all these excuses. When in reality, man, we should find the most prominent time in our day to give to the Lord, to spend time with Him. Man, when we give to the offering, man, are we giving after, I finagled my budgets. I've made sure that I've looked at my budgets and all the way, I'm going to give to make sure I don't receive any loss. Sometimes we look at our bank accounts and like, I have to give a portion. And you know what? We give just what is needed. We don't give our best. We make sure, after I figure out all the taxes, after I figured out all the bills, then I'll give. When in reality, we should give first, because that's what God honors. We need to give first because you know what? We need to love God more than what we possess. Man, when we serve at church, God calls us ourselves to be a living sacrifice in Romans 12:1. Often we're like, I don't have a lot of time this month to serve at church. And does God give us periods of times where we are busy in our life? Yes. But often we like to think, maybe if I have a free weekend, or maybe if I just, if I have a little time, then I'll serve. Instead of us trying to make time, making what God has given us prominent. That I want to give the Lord the best of my time and abilities, of my possessions. I want to give the best to the Lord. Now, I've really appreciated Numbers 11. You know what? God likes to emphasize thanksgiving to the people of Israel. And in verses 29 and 30 it says, and when you offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving to the Lord, offer it of your own free will. On the same day it shall be eaten. You shall leave none of it until morning. I am the Lord. Do we offer thanksgiving to God? And this offering of sacrifice of thanksgiving was an offering of their own free will. It's supposed to be, man, I'm so thankful for what the Lord is doing for me right now. I want to offer Him a sacrifice. And God did have laws and rules on how this was to be done, and they were supposed to follow it. When it says that, it shall be eaten, and none of it shall be left until the morning. The people of Israel weren't supposed to gorge themselves. They were allowed to eat of this offering. They weren't just supposed to gorge themselves with this meat and, save it for the trip on the way back. No, it was to be dedicated to the Lord as His, as an offering of thanksgiving. We've talked a whole lot about complaining. Man, you know what? We are very good at being complainers at times. It's a part of our nature. Man, but is there ever a time, you know what most of my prayer requests are throughout the day? Oh, man, my car's not sounding too good right now. Oh, man, Lord, I pray that it would keep running well. Oh, man, sometimes, we pray, man, Lord, that person's being really annoying. Smite them. Man, and the list goes on and on. Man, throughout your day, are you just ever overcome with thanksgiving? That, man, you pray thanksgiving to God daily. Man, God is doing this in my life. You know what we might need for our prayer list is, man, a section about, man, praises of what God has been doing in my life and in this week. You know what? It's awesome that we have these prayer requests and we get to pray for one another. That's amazing. But often when we hear prayer requests, we think, man, what went wrong this week? What could go wrong in the next week? And you know what? We need to bring all things to God in prayer. But too often we skip over thanksgiving because we're complainers. We've talked about, how the people of Israel, man, they pretty much were spitting God's face. They weren't looking back. They're like, man, well, they're looking back in the wrong way. Man, it would have been better if I would have been in Egypt. Man, it would have been better if I was a slave. Man, at least I had food there. And we look at the people of Israel like, man, those guys were foolish. They've seen the miracles of God. They've seen what God has done. Man, when they look back, man, they should be thankful. All throughout Leviticus, God keeps mentioning, you are my people. I'm the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt. But the thing is, we often look back. And you know what we miss? We miss what Christ did for us. See, God delivered the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt. But you know what, Christian? You were delivered out of bondage too. And we need to be thankful because of that. We need to be thankful because of what God has given us. And that truly is acceptable in God's sight. One who offers thanksgiving to Him. One who offers praises to God above all else. We need to follow God's standard. We need to follow God's standard of what He has said is acceptable in His sight. And He has shown to us what that is in His Word. And the question I have for you today is, am I a person people can follow? Are you like a Charles Barkley who can say, don't follow me, follow somebody else? Or are you a person that people can look at and say, that's one who's holy and pure unto God, who has followed His standard and is acceptable in His sight? Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for this time we've had to go through the book of Leviticus and just looking at what your standard was for the priest. And Lord, thank you so much for what you did for us. And Lord, for your giving of this word so that we can understand what your standard is. Lord, that we can know how to be holy and acceptable in your sight. And Lord, just help us to be one that desires you above all else. And in Jesus' name, amen.